Our first speaker is Holden and Rasmussen, whose work some of you will already be familiar with. He has participated in both previous installments of this conference. Holden is an early career researcher based at Newcastle University, where he is currently completing a PhD under the supervision of Lorenzo Chiesa and Adam Potts. His dissertation explores the distinct yet compatible accounts of the ontological category of the limit in the work of Georges Bataille and Jacques Lacan. His broader research interests include psychoanalysis, aesthetics, post-Kantian idealism and materialism, and queer theory. Holden has published in the European Journal of Psychoanalysis and Filozofsky Westnik, where his article titled "The Dialectic of the Limit" is available online. His paper today is titled "Another Body, Another Fantasy, From Perversion Through Fantasy to Psychosexuality." Holden, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arsalan. Okay, I will get right into it. So, Toshio Matsumoto's 1969 film Funeral Parade of Roses opens on an amended quotation from Baudelaire's Fleurs du Mal: "I am the wound and the blade, the victim and the executioner." The film blends documentary interviews with gender non-conforming people of 1960s Tokyo, together with a retelling of the Oedipus myth. And this latter thread follows the life of Eddie in a very disjointed montage. Eddie works as a sex worker and hostess at the Jine, a gay bar in Tokyo. The much abbreviated story goes like this, though in some ways my linear presentation is a betrayal of the film. As a child, Eddie was beaten by her father. When her father abandons Eddie and her mother, Eddie suggests to her mother that though Eddie's father has abandoned them, she still has Eddie to support her. Her mother simply laughs at her. Sometime later, Eddie finds her mother with another man, and Eddie stabs them both using a knife. Now an adult, Eddie works at the Jine, and the Jine is managed by drug dealer Gonda, with whom Lida, another trans woman and the madam of the bar, lives. The two are in a relationship. However, Lida correctly begins to suspect that Eddie and Gonda have a secret sexual relationship. To Eddie, Gonda then promises to make her the new madam of the bar. After some time, Lida is later found lying in her bed, having committed suicide, draped in a veil and surrounded by roses. On the floor are two dolls, one with a nail in its upper chest and the other with a nail in each eye. After Lida's funeral, Eddie is promoted to Madam of the Jine, as Gonda promised. While Eddie takes a shower, Gonda finds a book containing a photograph of Eddie with her parents. Though a hole has been burnt through the face of Eddie's father in the picture, Gonda recognizes Eddie's mother as his former lover and the young child as his. Upon this realization, Gonda kills himself with a knife. And upon seeing this scene, Eddie takes the knife and stabs herself in each eye before stumbling outside in front of a crowd of people. So those familiar can already tell how this is a parody of the classical myth. Instead of the son killing the father and sleeping with the mother, it would seem a strict inversion has occurred. The daughter has killed the mother and slept with the father. However, the picture is far more complicated, not least because Eddie is not a cisgender man or woman, but perhaps more importantly because of the play of psychosexual resemblance and difference incarnated in the androgyny of all of the players. There's only one actual confirmed heterosexual cisgender person in the entire film. And it doesn't take a powerful imagination to conjure up classical psychoanalytic interpretations of this parody of Oedipus. And in fact, one could argue that this parody confirms the invariance of the Oedipal schema as articulated by Freud. But my primary aim is not to discuss this film, but to use it to foreground the motivating questions of my inquiry, of which I present only a fragment to you today. Is Oedipus invariant? And which schemata of Oedipus are we bound to refer to and return to in our theory? Does any Oedipal schema necessitate conformity to a path of normal psychosexual development, whereby the man or the woman, as the case may be, lives up to the ideal of their sex? Or can another body, another fantasy, form on the same structures that undergird Oedipus? In short, is there a psychosexual destiny for the subject? In a 1967 article in Cahiers pour l'analyse, a young student at the École Normale Supérieure and a near-religious attendee of Lacan's weekly séminaire comes to the same question, though certainly not with the same intentions and interests as mine. Today, we will follow the tracks that Jacques Nassif plots to reach this question. The article he authored, entitled Fantasy in A Child is Being Beaten, will be translated into English and published in Filozofski Vestnik later this year, alongside some commentary. Here, Jacques Nassif subjects Freud's 1919 A Child is Being Beaten, a contribution to the study of the origin of sexual perversions, to a provocative reading operation, which Nassif characterizes with the following, quote, "There is no doubt that in Freud's manifest project, the fantasy of fustigation is exposed and detailed only in order to provide an example of perversion, the veritable focus of interest. What we would like to do is properly decenter the subject to shift the spotlight and focus it on a precise sequence of the theoretical field that Freud works on. In short, to act as if the problem of fantasy at the level of a latent project were being approached for its own sake through this text." Nassif then tells us the intriguing result of his decision to treat the elaboration of fantasy as the manifest project of Freud's text. The fantasy, crystallized in the statement, "A child is being beaten," is not a fantasy belonging to an individual neurosis, but is, quote, "a metaphorical representation of a fundamental fantasy. In this case, it is a castration fantasy, whose role is to express the origin of the difference of the sexes." Indeed, he claims that his reading illuminates an archaeology of the subject, and this archaeology uncovers processes of differentiation and identification as base elements of a fundamental fantasy that the beating fantasy presents in a minimally obstructed form. The origin of sexual difference expresses itself through the play of differences, presences, and absences in the permutations that Freud details in the study of 6 cases. Now, all of this seems to lead to the conclusion that it is sexual difference, castration, and Oedipus that determine the processes and course of identification and subject formation. But this implication, in Nassif's own analysis, is a temptation, and not well-founded, since the matter can be immediately unsettled by posing a necessary question. Nassif closes the article on this discussion, writing, "If it is on the structure exposed by castration that the fantasy of being beaten is grafted, it is obviously not the difference of the sexes that by itself makes the fundamental fantasy." Or one could ask oneself, could another fantasy not form with a different verbalization on the ground of the same structure, based on the same archaeological foundation, but according to the individual history of a particular body? This is the question I set before you today. Could another fantasy not form with a different verbalization on the ground of the same structure exposed by castration, based on the same archaeological foundation, but according to the history of a different body? In other words, are sexual difference, castration, and Oedipus intertwined in such a way to destine the subject for a particular formation, a normal path of psychosexual development or sexuation? To propel Nassif's examination forward, I propose a side-tracking of his reading, one that foregrounds an elaboration of the concept of psychosexual drive as if it were the manifest project of Freud's and Nassif's texts. So I will trace some of Nassif's steps in order to conduct a reading that will permit responding to the question he poses at its close. So let me begin with a reminder of the permutations of the beating fantasy in Freud's text, and then partially reconstruct the reading Nassif provides thereof. In Freud's text, he posits that there are 3 phases of the beating fantasy. The form "a child is being beaten," from which the title takes its name, is phase C, and it is what first appears in analysis as an utterance made in free association. The absence of the batterer from the verbalization, or the wording, as Freud puts it in English, is the most obvious feature of this permutation, as is the seeming anonymity of the child being beaten. In phase A, which is temporally the earliest phase, the child derives pleasure from fantasizing a beating of a rival. The child being beaten, quote, "is invariably another child, most often a brother or a sister if there is any. The one doing the beating is the father." So the fantasy is worded as, and this is Freud's wording, "My father is beating the child," then in parentheses, "he only loves me." Here it is clear who is hurt and who is loved, but the loving is implied, parenthetical, and dependent on the hateful harm inflicted on this rival child. It is only in phase B that the child producing the fantasy, so the author of the fantasy, becomes the one being beaten by the father. According to Nassif, this, quote, is what Freud expresses in the language of overdetermination, which is actually the language of co-presence in the same archaeological disposition where being beaten itself continues to signify being loved. The wording in phase B is modified to, my father is beating me, or I am being beaten by my father. Thusly, loving and hating become entwined by the verb to beat, or battre in French. For Nassif, this phase is paramount because it attests to the fact that there is no simple disappearance of the batterer from the fantasy. Between my father is beating the child and a child is being beaten, there is a distinctive break and a transformation rather than a simple effacement or a repression, all evinced by the B phase form. So to summarize, the A phase is my father is beating the child, in parentheses, he only loves me. In phase B, my father is beating me. And then in phase C, a child is being beaten. In tracing these permutations and the shifts that occur in a play of resemblance and difference, Nassif, following Freud's text very closely, explains that his reading entails following 3 tracks that Freud himself highlights. First, the track of the content of the fantasy, who is being beaten and who the batterer is. The second track is the object of the fantasy, which here Freud and Nassif use object to refer to the sex of the beaten child. And then the third track is that of the signification of the fantasy, and specifically the interplay of love and hate through the verb to beat, the sort of knot of the fantasy that remains unchanged across all of the permutations. So my sidetrack of Nassif will begin on the second track, that of the object. And I will redefine this object not as the sex of the child being beaten, but as the psychosexual drive itself, demonstrating why this is demanded of the text of the fantasy itself. The analysis of signification will accordingly change to an examination and position of ambivalence as the integral feature of psychosexuality and the drive to co. So, the first track focuses on the content of the beating fantasy. The content refers to the description of the roles played out in the scene. So who's being beaten, who's doing the beaten. In all of the cases, there's the latest formulation with the content, a child is being beaten. And it's sort of the invariance of this very passive form that prompts Freud to write the article in the first place. The batterer is undisclosed, and the author of the fantasy is merely a spectator looking on. In phase B, the content is almost always a construction in analysis. It takes the form, my father is beating me. This construction aims at rendering clear for the analysand that what is at stake in the fantasy is the repression of their sexual choice for their father, though quite a complex interplay of repression and regression as Nassif and Freud detail. Whereas at first the fantasy is the child's imagined reality of a punishment for those whom they must share the father's affection, so that's phase A, the phase B permutation is only made possible by a repression of the pleasure associated with the object choice for the father, transforming a verb to love into a verb associated with displeasure, to beat, and changing the role of the author of the fantasy from onlooker to the beaten child. Nassif here highlights that in focusing on the content of the fantasy for its own sake, rather than for the sake of describing the origin of the perversions, we begin to see that we are dealing with some remnant of castration, the very early encounter with the fact of the difference of the sexes, and its later ossification into the Oedipus complex. This is because the transformations of the fantasy are characterized by the changes, or lack thereof, in the sex of each of the players. At this stage, Nassif tells us that his reading only describes horizontal modifications and differences. Little boys are like this, little girls are like that. And this accomplishes little in the way of constructing an archaeology of the subject or an account of the relation between fantasy and subject formation, which is his goal in the article. So the second track, that of the object, advances the endeavor, finally. By object, Nassif and Freud are referring to the sex of the person being beaten in any of the permutations of the fantasy. For the sake of time, I will focus on the B phase of the fantasy, because it is here where this definition of the object provides the least clarity. In phase B, the child being beaten is the same as the author of the fantasy, and the batterer is always the father. Though the child is the same as the author, the child bears distinctively androgynous traits and an androgynous signification, which further obscures the differentiation Freud and Nassif make between object and signification in the first place. And Nassif himself even continually sort of remarks on the instability in the phase B of identifying the object straightforwardly. Crucially, in one of the cases Freud examines, this phase B is not repressed and is not a construction. It is the fantasy enunciated in the course of the analysis, and it is an adult homosexual man who authors this fantasy. Here's where I intervene and shift the focus from fantasy to psychosexuality. Certainly, the breaks between the permutations, as they are constructed over the course of a psychoanalysis, attest to the play of resemblance and difference rather than a chain of cause and effect, as Nassif himself claims. Yet this interplay bears a relation not only to the triggering encounter of castration and the supposed path of Oedipus, it bears a relation to the psychosexual reality of the unconscious, wherein no identification or orientation exists separate from the process or arc or montage of a drive. The constitutive androgyny and ambivalence incarnated in the phase B form reveals itself to be the fulcrum upon which the entire drama of these fantasies, across their phases and permutations, is unfolding. And this is why, even in those cases where phase B is just a construction, this is why the construction works. It has to somehow get a fragment of the fulcrum that's making all of these processes in the fantasies operant. So to begin this sidetracking of the initial track Nassif has led us on, let us revisit Freud's simplification or schematization of the Oedipus complex. In The Ego and the Id, Freud writes, and this is a long quote, apologies, "It would appear, therefore, that in both sexes, the relative strength of the masculine and feminine sexual dispositions is what determines whether the outcome of the Oedipus situation shall be an identification with the father or with the mother. This is one of the ways in which bisexuality takes a hand in the subsequent vicissitudes of the Oedipus complex. The other way is even more important, for one gets an impression that the simple Oedipus complex is by no means its commonest form, but rather represents a simplification or schematization, which, to be sure, is often enough justified for practical purposes. Closer study usually discloses the more complete Oedipus complex, which is twofold, positive and negative, and is due to the bisexuality originally present in children. That is to say, a boy has not merely an ambivalent attitude towards his father and an affectionate object choice towards his mother, but at the same time, he also behaves like a girl and displays an affectionate feminine attitude to his father, and a corresponding jealousy and hostility towards his mother. It is this complicating element introduced by bisexuality that makes it so difficult to obtain a clear view of the facts in connection with the earliest object choices and identifications, and still more difficult to describe them intelligibly. At first glance, this exhibits nothing new under the sun. Yet if one reads the next sentence, Freud makes a remarkable, underestimated qualification, writing, quote, "It may even be that the ambivalence displayed in the relations to the parents should be attributed entirely to bisexuality, and that it is not, as I have represented above, developed out of identification in consequence of rivalry." When I read this term bisexuality, I read it as the expression of the unfocused sexual libido and the ambivalent self-identification, and more properly, it should be designated by the term psychosexuality. In the unconscious, so unfocused is the libido that to even designate one's orientation as bidirectional is already too much. It is, as Lacan says, always a partial drive. The primary point here is that the simple form of the Oedipus complex tends to say too much as well, because it is by no means the commonest form. This ambivalence, even in the concepts of which I am dealing now before you, is expressed in the entanglement of castration with Oedipus. There's no identification achieved on the basis of rivalry with the parent of the same sex without the anxiety of castration. And yet, the B phase of the fantasy, my father is beating me, I'm being beaten by my father, indelibly depends on the retention of the constitutively unfocused valences of psychosexuality. Ergo, perhaps we should keep our ears cocked, as Lacan advises, when Freud tells us that the rivalry over affection is only a provisional formulation. Indeed, perhaps it has more to do with psychosexuality than it does with rivalry. If there is indeed a confusion of pleasure and displeasure made possible by the confusion of beating for lovemaking, in this reconstruction, the father is loving and hating at the same time, in the B phase. So where is the rivalry and where is the identification? It seems that Freud's simplified schema of Oedipus does not hold here. Shifting the focus onto a new object, not of the sex of the child being beaten, but the object of psychosexuality, renders this montage of fantasies a bit more lucid. We're not dealing here with a fantasy made solely in confrontation with sexual difference, but with a confrontation with the montage of a psychosexual drive itself. In this way, object and signification, though they are partitioned in Freud's text and Nassif's reading, are in reality blended, or to be more precise, they are co-present, to borrow Nassif's term. More importantly, I will flag here that my reading suggests that the distinguishing features between the explicit content of the fantasy and the drive itself are dependent on one another, and their distinction is somewhat annulled, but in a peculiar way. This co-presence of object and signification, as well as, to quote Freud's constant characterization of ambivalence, the co-presence of processes, quote, different in their nature, which is typical of ambivalence, is on full display in the B phase of the fantasy. As I've said, for one analysand, phase B was not just a construction. Classically, this can be read as the perverse form of the fantasy, with all of its strongly homosexual and masculine valences. Of this, Nassif writes, the pervert, in fact, does not repress his fantasy, but sets out to confuse the object with the meaning or signification it has taken, and then to play with this confusion. In the fantasy of being beaten, for example, the boy's attitude is clearly homosexual and feminine. However, phase C has the strange feature that the boy retains a feminine attitude without making a homosexual object choice, since the person who beats is the mother or one of her substitutes, end quote. If we follow my sidetrack, then it would seem that we actually lose this distinction between neurotic and perverse fantasy, since the object no longer directly concerns the anatomy of the child being beaten. The refusal to define what is unfocused emphasizes the instability of the permutations of the fantasy. However, this observation quoted by Nassif demonstrates that this is not so, for the fantasy depends upon the instability of the identification and object choice in both its perverse and neurotic forms. To quote Freud, from A Child is Being Beaten, the boy who has tried to escape from a homosexual object choice and who has not changed his sex, nevertheless feels like a woman in his conscious fantasies and endows the women who are beating him with masculine attributes and characteristics. This psychosexual androgyny incarnated in each of the players of the scene and driving its transformations evinces at least one case when the simple form of the Oedipus complex does not hold and where the object of anatomical sex is, properly speaking, uninteresting, since the formal co-presence of different identifications between resemblance and difference constitutes the motion of the drive towards an ill-defined psychosexual aim and not an anatomical, specularizable object. At first glance, this collapses the object with its signification. And you might say, but wait, Holden, you just claimed that your approach does not collapse the perverse form into the neurotic form. Are you not returning us to an examination of the aetiology of the perversions in the new close of the polymorphously perverse sexuality of the infant somehow retained into adulthood? And this interruption would certainly be a correct characterization if I were to posit that the signification overshadows or takes priority over the ill-defined object of an unfocused and psychosexual drive. In fact, this cannot be the case from the perspective I have adopted. What can be the case is that the signification and the object exist side by side, unilaterally, with no precedence or priority. This is a fact that Freud notes, and that Nassif draws our attention to in a footnote, in a long passage from Drives and Their Vicissitudes, which I won't quote in fully and just paraphrase. Here, Freud explicitly illustrates how drive processes never follow clean breaks and do not proceed stage by stage. They don't sort of layer on top of one another like strata in the earth, but rather he likens the life of the drive to surges of lava, cooling in uneven layers one atop the other, obscuring and even annulling distinctions and breaks between one drive process and another. Psychosexuality is thus itself ambivalent. Ambivalence does not simply describe the feelings, but something about the core of the subject, the fundamental fantasy and the drive. And furthermore, it seems that it doesn't proceed in distinct or clean stages. What do I mean in saying that psychosexuality is itself ambivalent, that the object of my analysis, this object that is the very ground of psychoanalysis, I would claim, is constitutively ambivalent? Tadej Troja distills the core of ambivalence in the Freudian discovery in writing, "The frequent coexistence of love and hate, their simultaneous focus on the same object, provides the most important example of the ambivalence of feeling. If this were all, ambivalence would serve only as a description of a special case of reversal. More precisely, it would designate the consequences of the cases of reversal, the coexistence of opposite feelings that a subject has for the same object. Thus, I mean that all psychosexuality depends on the co-presence and coexistence of things different in nature in relation to the same object of the drive, something Freud recognizes in A Child is Being Beaten." Troja explains further, "The motif for extending the use of the concept seems clear. What makes up the essence of ambivalence is not determined substantially in terms of love and hate, but is a matter of a formal coexistence. Consequently, despite the explicit separation of the two types of reversal into opposites, the two share a common point that concerns precisely the failure of the reversal. The second member of the pair does not eliminate the first one, so love does not eliminate hate or vice versa. The substitute does not annul the original. In this sense, ambivalence is no longer a specific characteristic of a special case of the reversal into opposite, but precisely the point in which both processes that are declaratively different in nature lose their fundamental distinguishing feature." With this sidetracking of the analysis of fantasy in A Child is Being Beaten, what this sidetracking of the analysis of fantasy in A Child is Being Beaten further illuminates is that, at least in fantasy making, in fantasizing, this formalization more aptly explains the Oedipal configuration. This accords with that same admission on Freud's part that instead of rivalry, the constitutive psychosexual ambivalence towards one's parents may lie at the root of the subject's drive and desire. Yet if the simple form of the Oedipal complex and its codependence with a simple form of the castration complex do not hold in all cases, then what would be this ground, the scar that Freud mentions in A Child is Being Beaten and which Nassif himself casts as some structure preceding castration and Oedipus? I think here we come to a not very surprising conclusion, at least for Lacanians. The scar of Oedipus is an image of the remainder left behind by the vanishing of the subject in the drive process. To paraphrase Alinka Zupancic, in fantasy, the subject falls out of reality as an object among other objects. Across the permutations of the fantasy in A Child is Being Beaten, this is indicated everywhere, whether it be by the necessary absence of the subject in the scene or the immersion of the subject in its subjective dimension as a body to be and made to be formally loved and hated simultaneously. Or more precisely, formally or positionally androgenized again and again in the repetitive action of the fantasy, even across its breaks. What my tracking seems to plot is that if there is an archaeology of the subject and a destiny for this subject, it is not forged on the basis of sexual difference, but on the impossibility of the subject itself, a logical modality that is begotten by psychosexual drive processes. We could summarize this preliminary conclusion with the following: I am the wound and the blade, the victim and the executioner. At once, the site of an annulment and the instrument of that annulment itself. In the final moments of Funeral Parade of Roses, right after Eddie has pierced both of her eyes with the knife that Gonda, her father, has used to slit his own throat, a shot of a man suddenly appears and interrupts the scene. "It was frightening, wasn't it?" he asks the viewer. "The cursed destiny of man. It was such a unique film with cruelty and laughter. Let's look forward to the film. Sayonara, sayonara, sayonara." We return to the site of Eddie stumbling onto the street, blind and bloody, just like Oedipus King. The same cruel destiny, but another body, another fantasy. For psychoanalysis, it is by no means possible to assert a beyond of sexual difference, an anti-Oedipus, if you will. But if what we mean by the Oedipus complex is its simplest form tied to the simplest form of a castration complex, then psychoanalysis has no means to hear and see verbalizations, bodies, and fantasies like those that would belong to Eddie or any of the other people who are interviewed in the process of a Funeral Parade of Roses. And what is more, psychoanalysis would perhaps miss how bodies and fantasies like those documented and dramatized in Funeral Parade of Roses necessitate the Lacanian paradigm of psychosexuality, which begets the subject that loses itself from the beginning. The sidetracking I have performed from Nassif's reading of A Child is Being Beaten, however, goes some way towards reconciling Oedipus with the reality of the constitutive ambivalence and precipitant androgyny of psychosexual life. It opens the suggestion that there are indeed other bodies and other fantasies that are not beyond sexual difference, but rather indicate its very conditionality. The psychosexual fragility of sexual difference as such, and the ineluctable ground for psychoanalysis and philosophy in their contemporary confrontation with bodies, fantasies, and verbalizations of another kind. Thank you.
Thank you, Holden, for this thought-provoking paper. Questions, comments? We have 15 minutes for.
Thank you for the paper. I'm really excited that we're on the same panel because I think in some ways this question will precipitate my paper, but and I actually don't know if it's a question, so to be fair, let me give it a shot. It occurred to me when you were speaking, something that hasn't occurred to me before, that in this formulation, a child is being beaten, we have a really perfect counterpart to the first stage of the Oedipus complex as Lacan formulates it. So in that moment, the Oedipus complex is made up of the fact that the child says something else is wanted, eliding itself, but wanting to be in the place of that empty thing. So if we elide the father in A Child is Being Beaten, right, there's the subject of this sentence is precisely missing. And I guess it just made me think that if we render more precise what is meant by the Oedipus complex for Lacan and locate specifically what he's doing in, say, the fifth seminar, and even more specifically, we're not even yet at the point of the paternal metaphor, but really kind of dwelling with this initial something else is wanted, I know not what, it's not me, but my fantasy, of course, is that it can be me, that maybe it is one way of kind of rendering specific the intuition that you ended with, which I think is the right one, that there is something about the impossibility of the subject that we're being shown with this. So again, I'm not sure if it's a question, but if you have any responses, I'd be excited to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this sort of track that I tried to plot here, I mean, I wish I could have made it more clear when I was revising the presentation as well, but there is, like, across the permutations, very good examples of the different times of the drive as well. And I think, like, that third time, the, like, making oneself seen or making oneself heard or whatever it is like a very precise formulation on Lacan's part, precisely this moment of that you're referring to in Seminar 5. Of course, I'm referring to a formulation in Seminar 11, but I think certainly it attests to a certain, I suppose, a certain skepticism that I think we should have towards Freud's insistence that the simple form of Oedipus has practical value. Well, sometimes it doesn't. And it's precisely because of the entwinement of Oedipus with the drive, structurally. And that's what I would say.
Any more questions? Please.
Oh, thank you, Holden. It's nice to see that actually you're opening up new things after an almost completed PhD, so excellent. Two broad questions. I mean, the presentation was super elegant and super linear, but how should I put it? I sensed a kind of like lingering, let's move beyond not only a traditional Freudian Oedipus complex, but also beyond Lacan's name for the same and updating, which would be basically the phallic logic or logical fantasy. They're more or less the same, which is Lacan's updating of the Oedipus. So correct me if I'm wrong, then I have a more specific question, but it seems you're saying, especially towards the end, it's not enough to start from, bluntly put, sexual difference qua the absence of the sexual relationship in order to account for the Japanese film, basically. So if you want to open it up even more, to account for non-conformity in terms of like sexuation. And if you're going there, I remain like an old-fashioned Lacanian, and I'm saying, yes, we need to go beyond the standard Freudian Oedipus, well, which is not just, it's invariant, but obviously the problem for Freud is specifically finding a female Oedipus, right? I mean, this is like a long battle for Freud, right? But I'm not sure whether you don't have answers to that already in Lacan. Well, obviously it opens up the very topical question of like, can Lacanian psychoanalysis, for instance, account for transgender, et cetera, and it seemed to me you were saying almost no, whereas I would be, for a number of reasons we can discuss, very tempted to say, if you read Lacan in a certain way, as actually being quite different from Freud, there's enough in Lacan to just stick to the logic of fantasy qua phallic logic without looking for a new signifier, which I thought you were doing by calling it psychosexuality. I mean, what is the logic of fantasy? It is psychosexuality. Mm-hmm. So you see where I'm going?
Yeah, I do see where you're going, and I think it's understandable. I myself wouldn't actually say that I'm trying to depart too far from that. And in an earlier iteration of this presentation, I dealt much more with the text, the signification of the phallus, and Tim Dean's 2000 book Beyond Sexuality, and taking up this specific question, where I mean, Dean argues that we should just forget the phallus. We have objet petita. We don't need the phallus. And I myself am not so certain about that either. If you read Lacan in a particular way, I think in the way that you're describing and alluding to here. What I think, I mean, speaking of sort of like orthodox Lacanian approaches to these phenomena, I mean, Quatre Milo is maybe the most infamous, like, for taking on this issue, and Milo tends to understand specifically transgender women as simply wanting to be the woman in a sense, and this for her is reason not to indulge the fantasy and not to allow someone to receive surgical changes or hormone treatment and so on and so on. But what I think is I think Milo herself has a dearth of clinical evidence to make this claim. She conducts a lot of interviews with what we would say are trans men, but none with trans women, which I think is quite telling. But if you indulge me for a moment, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but there is documentary evidence in this film and amongst others where you do have, gender non-conforming people, what we would say are transgender women now. I mean, they use different words and different language to articulate what they are because it's Japan in the 60s. And many of them actually demonstrate quite a lucid account of their own fantasy and their own relation to their desire and their desire for transformation or lack thereof. So, for example, the interviewer asks one woman in particular, "Are you happy, as you are living?" And the person says no. And then the interviewer says, "So why don't you stop? Like, you're anatomically a man. Like, stop dressing like a woman, basically." And the woman replies, "I would be just as unhappy, in a sense. Like, I get some pleasure from this. So why not do it?" And I think this is I think that type of enunciation is perfectly in line with what we typically describe as like traversals of fantasy, and may even contest the idea that all gender non-conforming people want to be transformed in the same way and want to be transformed into the same thing, as Milo tends to reduce it to. And two, maybe that type of transformation is actually an effective means of providing the analysand or the subject a realization that what is dysfunctional is the symbolic itself. So I know that was kind of an ambling answer, but I mean, you and I have had conversations about this in the past, and we'll have more about it. But that's where I would go. I too think I'm not departing too far from Lacan, but you and I can discuss that later.
Please.
Yes, I mean, thanks a lot for that. I mean, I guess my question is maybe just one of clarification, if I understood kind of the move that you're making. I mean, whether you want to, maintain, kind of like a kind of foundational difference between the impossibility of the subject and sexuation. Because in part, I guess because it seems like maybe the implications of what you want to do is to say that the question of sexual difference is itself always normative. I mean, that in other words, then it always is even if it disavows it, it's naturalizing and reintroduces a complementarity of the sexes, which, the drive theory initially wanted to sort of obviously undo. So then the issue is, I mean, I guess you already see where maybe my question is whether, because there's the other way of approaching it where the question of sexuation is what's requisite precisely to disturb the reintroduction of a notion of sexuality as that of complementarity, which would be, naturalizing. So I guess, yeah, I haven't really maybe, but I think you can see maybe what you could clarify your position vis-a-vis that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly, like, as at least the sort of drive theory that I presented certainly contests that idea of complementarity, but so too does the formalization, there is no sexual relationship. And I think that's why this sort of version of the drive theory and what I would say is a intentional complexification and sort of insistence on a kind of fragile Oedipus complex actually conforms to that idea that there is an absence of the sexual relation. Nonetheless, there is, of course, sexual difference, but I think it's precisely like what is attested to in these cases is that the fantasies themselves are kind of spurred by an impossibility of really like rectifying the fact that there is a sort of sexual difference. And then all of these identifications and ambivalences can actually be incarnated in one body in the scene of the fantasy. So yeah, I'm not sure if this sort of goes some way to addressing your question, but I mean, I see what I presented as being fully in line with this conception that, okay, yes, we do have a sort of biological sexual dimorphism. It's not to be underestimated. But nonetheless, there is no sexual relation, or it cannot be written as such. And I think that the fantasy in a child is being beaten illustrates and exemplifies this impossibility quite elegantly.
I think, yeah, we have time for a quick question. If there is any question, we can take it. Otherwise, I think that brings us to a close to your part. Thank you very much again. Please join me to...
Thank you all.